The woman at table 22 arrived 7 minutes before the doors opened, and the first thing the event coordinator noticed was her dress. It was ivory, floor length. It had a small tear at the left hem, maybe 2 centimeters, that someone had repaired with thread that was almost but not quite the right shade. The coordinator, a man named Festus Darko, whose lanyard read Accra Heritage Gala/staff, looked at the dress the way people look at a fruit they cannot identify. Then, he looked at the woman wearing it, then back at the dress. He said nothing and showed her to the table. She sat without adjusting her chair. She set her purse, a small brown leather purse with a brass clasp, the kind that closed with a satisfying click, on the table in front of her, and she folded her hands. And she waited. What the other 41 people at the Heritage Grand would discover over the next 3 hours was something that would be discussed at their tables for the rest of the evening, repeated in car rides home, typed into WhatsApp messages by midnight, and told to children over the following weeks in the way that stories are told when they contain something true. But right now, at 6:47 p.m., on a Thursday in November, the woman at table 22 was simply waiting. And not one person in that room knew what she was waiting for. Her name was Adara Mensah Boateng, and she was 54 years old. She was 5'4", and the ivory dress fit her the way clothes fit someone who has kept the same body through discipline rather than comfort, not effortlessly, but with the precision of a person who has had no room to be imprecise about herself for a long time. She had lost 11 pounds in the 14 months since her husband passed, not because she was trying to, but because cooking for one produces different portions than cooking for two. And she had not yet learned the new mathematics of solitude. Her hands, folded on the table, were the hands of a woman who had spent 29 years holding chalk. The knuckle of her right index finger had a small callus exactly where chalk rests when you are writing on a board for 7 hours a day, year after year, and the callus had not softened in the 2 years since she retired. Her face carried 54 years openly, not as damage, but as record. The kind of face that has earned the lines it holds. The dress had belonged to her mother. Beatrice Mensah had worn it to her own wedding in Kumasi in 1971, and when she died in 2018, she had folded it in a cloth pouch along with a handwritten note that said, in her small, careful letters, "For the occasion that deserves it." Adora had kept the dress in that pouch for 6 years, in the back of her wardrobe behind the winter coats she no longer wore. She had washed it twice by hand in the bathroom sink at her flat on Zorwulu Road, and both times she had let it dry flat on a towel on the floor, turning it once, slowly, the way her mother had shown her. The tear at the hem was from 1971. Beatrice had caught it on a chair leg at the reception and laughed about it for 40 years. Adara had repaired it herself, sitting at the kitchen table under the window light with a sewing needle she had borrowed from her neighbor Mrs. Asante, who lived in number 14 and kept needles in a tin with a lion on the lid. The purse with the brass clasp had also been her mother's. Inside it, Adora carried a folded envelope, a pen, a small photograph. Her mother at that same wedding in 1971, standing in this same dress outside a church in Kumasi, with her arms at her sides, looking directly at the camera the way people looked at cameras in 1971, with a seriousness that was not unfriendliness but rather a recognition that the image would outlast them. And 12 cedis and 40 pesewas, which was exactly what she had left after the taxi from Zorwulu Road to the Heritage Grand Hotel on Independence Avenue. She had received the invitation 4 weeks ago. It was typed on cream paper with a seal at the top, and it said that she was a guest of Mr. Olu Adeyemi Bright, founder, Bright Futures Foundation, and that her seat at the Accra Heritage Gala had been reserved for a purpose he would explain in person. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped under her door by the building's gate security. She had come home from the market to find it on the floor, and had stood in the doorway reading it with the shopping still in both hands. She had read the letter 3 times that evening. Then she had called her daughter Serwa in London, who had said, "Mummy, do you know this man?" And Adaura had said, "Not yet." She had spent the following 3 weeks trying to remember every student she had ever taught, which was a task like trying to count water. She had taught an estimated 3,200 students across a 29-year career at 3 different schools, the last being Akimoto Senior High School, where she had run the mathematics department for 11 of her final 14 years. There were students who had become doctors, one who had become an engineer on the Jubilee oil platform, several who had entered banking and telecommunications. She had received cards at retirement. She had not received a letter like this. She had not told Serwa about the dress. The room began to fill at 7:05 p.m. The Heritage Grand's East Ballroom held 400 people, and it filled the way important rooms fill in this city, slowly, then suddenly. The women arrived in geal and gown combinations that had required appointments weeks in advance. You could tell from the stiffness of the fabric, still holding the shape of the dressmaker's last adjustment. The men arrived in agbada that carried the specific starch of things worn once a year. There were city council members and professors, and the kind of business people whose names appear on the sides of buildings. There was a television anchor from GTV and 2 people who had been photographed for Forbes Africa, and a deputy minister whose security detail stood near the exit in dark suits, earpieces in, scanning the room with the professional restlessness of people paid to worry. The air in the ballroom smelled of something that cost more money than air conditioning typically smells like, something with a quality of cedar and something floral, released every 20 minutes from atomizers built into the ceiling vents. Underneath it, faint, was the smell of food being prepared somewhere below, onion and palm oil, and something sweet frying. The light came from chandeliers that the hotel had installed in 2019 during the renovation, and which were the kind of chandeliers that catch on camera better than in person, giving everything the amber quality of a memory. Table 22 was near the back left of the room, close to the kitchen corridor, where you could hear the sound of covered trays being stacked and unstacked. It was where events coordinators put guests they have not been briefed on, guests who exist in the program but have not been categorized, who have no corporate sponsor printed beside their name and no organizational affiliation in the registration system. Adora sat there and watched the room fill. She watched Festus Darko move between tables with the particular efficiency of someone managing 40 things and tracking 39 of them successfully. She watched 2 waiters argue quietly near the service door until a 3rd waiter appeared, and the argument resolved. She did not move her purse or adjust her chair or take out her phone the way the other people at nearby tables were doing. Checking messages, taking photographs of the centerpiece, photographing the menu card. The woman who sat down across from her at 7:19 p.m. was named Comfort Ekempong. Comfort was wearing a coral silk dress with matching coral earrings the size of small birds, and a perfume that arrived 2 seconds before she did. Something expensive and emphatic. She was accompanied by a man who pulled her chair out and then sat beside her without introducing himself, which meant he was either a husband or someone comfortable enough to behave like one. Comfort looked at Adaura the way Festus Darko had. The brief inventory that took less than a second and registered everything it needed to register. She smiled. The smile was the kind that required effort to make, and no effort to withdraw. By 7:34 p.m., 8 people had sat at table 22, and the conversation had settled into the language of proximity, the small talk that fills the space before a program begins. Someone mentioned traffic on the N1. Someone else mentioned a new restaurant on Cantonments Road that required reservations 3 weeks in advance. A man at the far end of the table asked whether anyone had seen the new development going up near the Tema motorway. Residential, 44 units, 700,000 cedis a floor. Adaura listened. She did not offer. When a woman named Grace, who had introduced herself as a portfolio manager at a bank on Independence Avenue, asked what Adaura did, Adaura said, quietly, "I was a teacher." Secondary school. Mathematics. Grace nodded in the way people nod when a conversation has reached its destination. The man who had asked about the Tema motorway development asked how long she had taught. Adaura said, 29 years. He nodded. He turned back to the man beside him. No one at table 22 asked which school. The food came at 8:10 p.m. It was jollof rice with a texture that signaled a kitchen that took itself seriously. Each grain separate, cooked in stock rather than water. Tomato red in a way that meant the base had been reduced for longer than most hotel kitchens would find economical. And grilled tilapia with lemon and a charred quality on the skin that was intentional. And a small bowl of Cantonmire stew that smelled of palm oil and groundnuts and something slow-cooked, and fried plantain that had been cut diagonally and came out a color between gold and amber that meant they had been ripe for exactly the right number of days before frying. Adaura ate deliberately. She set her fork down between bites. She was not performing restraint. This was simply how she ate, how she had always eaten, how her mother had eaten, and her mother's mother. In the specific, unhurried way of women who have had to be careful with things and have not seen any reason to stop being careful with them when careful times ended. It was Comfort Akiampong who said it. She said it at 8:23 p.m., not loudly, but not quietly enough. She leaned toward the man beside her, her head tilting in the direction of table 22's end nearest the kitchen corridor, and said, in the tone of someone sharing a mild observation about the decor, "She looks like she wandered in from a uniform shop. That dress is older than this building." The man beside her did not respond, but Grace heard it. Grace looked up from her plate. She looked at Adaura, who was looking at her food, fork in her right hand, cutting a piece of fish from the bone with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to waste. Grace looked back at Comfort. Comfort was already reaching for her wine glass, a gesture that served as punctuation to a sentence she considered complete. The man at the end of the table who had asked about the Tema motorway development had heard it too. He picked up his fork and looked at the middle distance above Adaura's head for a moment, and then looked back at his plate. Adaura set down her fork. Not dropped, set down, with the same deliberateness with which she did everything. She opened her purse. She took out the pen. She took out the folded envelope. She placed both on the table beside her plate, the pen parallel to the envelope, both parallel to the edge of the table, the way she had always arranged things on a desk before a lesson began. And she waited. If this story is already doing what I think it's doing to you, stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes is something not one person in that ballroom saw coming. The program began at 9:05 p.m. The MC had a voice that arrived before he did, filling the room from the front table to the kitchen corridor without effort or amplification adjustment. He opened with the history of the foundation, 11 years old, operating across 5 regions, having put 3,847 students through secondary and tertiary education on full bursary since 2015. He named the corporate sponsors, a telecommunications company, 2 banks, a logistics firm, an international NGO partner. He acknowledged the deputy minister. He thanked the hotel and the organizing committee and the volunteers, 15 of them, who had arrived at 7 a.m. that morning to arrange 400 settings by hand He said that this evening's gala was also a celebration of a specific milestone, the Foundation's first endowed scholarship chair, funded by a single private gift of 4 million setis, the largest individual donation the Foundation had received in its 11-year history. The room received this with applause that took about 8 seconds to fully arrive, and arrive well. Then, the MC said that the founder of the Bright Futures Foundation had asked to address the room himself, and he gestured to the left of the stage, and a man walked out. Olu Adeyemi Bright was 67 years old and wore a dark blue kente trimmed agbada with no jewelry that was visible and no security detail. He was heavyset and carried it without apology. He walked the way people walk when they have stopped monitoring the effect they are producing, which is to say, without performance. When he reached the microphone, he stood there for a moment before he spoke, looking out at the room, his hands at his sides, unhurried in the way of a man who has been in enough rooms to know that the room will wait. He said, "I want to tell you about a woman." The room quieted. Not the polite quiet of the MC's opening remarks, something different. The quiet of people who have sensed, without being told, that what follows is not standard programming. He said, "In 1993, I was 19 years old, and I was failing Form 4 mathematics. Failing is generous. I was not present. I had decided, with the full confidence of a 19-year-old who does not know what a decision costs, that mathematics was for other people. People with a specific kind of brain that I had not been issued." He paused. "My school was St. Augustine's College in Cape Coast, and there was a teacher there, a young teacher, 26 years old, first year in the classroom, who stopped me in the corridor one afternoon after a failed end-of-term examination and said something to me that I have thought about on every working day of my life since. He looked down at the microphone stand. He touched it once, lightly, with his right hand, as if confirming it was real. Then he let his hand fall. He said, "She said, the problem is not that you cannot do mathematics. The problem is that nobody has yet shown you that mathematics is a language. And you already speak 3 languages. So you already have the capacity. You are not deficient. You are untranslated." Grace put her fork down. The man at the end of the table put his fork down. Comfort Akiampong set her wineglass on the table very slowly, with the care of someone suddenly uncertain about what her hands should be doing. Untranslated, Olu Adeyemi Bright said the word again. Not for emphasis, because it still carried its full weight after 31 years. That teacher stayed with me for 45 minutes after the school day ended, in a classroom with a broken ceiling fan in the last week of April, and she translated. She showed me how algebra is a sentence with a missing word, how a fraction is a conversation between 2 numbers about how to share, how a variable is simply a seat being held for someone who has not arrived yet. He stopped. I tried one problem. I got it wrong. She found a second way to explain it. I tried again. I got it wrong. She found a third way. I got it right. And then I got the next one right. And the next one. 11 problems in a row. Not because I had become suddenly capable. Because someone had found the language I was already speaking. He looked up. He looked at the room. Then he looked past the room, toward the back left, toward the kitchen corridor, toward table 22. She passed me through Form 4 mathematics. She passed me through WASA. She got me to university. Every company I have built, every student this foundation has funded, the chain goes back to 45 minutes in a classroom in Cape Coast in April 1993, when a teacher, who had been in a classroom for less than 1 year, decided that I was worth a third explanation. He stopped again. I have been looking for that teacher for 27 years. The room was the particular kind of quiet that 400 people produce when not one of them is willing to be the person who breaks it. Her name then was Adora Mensah. He looked directly toward table 22. She is now Adora Mensah Boateng. She taught mathematics at Achimota Senior High School for 14 of her 29 years in the classroom. She retired 2 years ago. A pause. She is sitting at table 22. Adora picked up her pen. She opened the folded envelope, not because she needed to write anything, but because the pen and the envelope were what she had brought, and she kept things in her hands when rooms turned toward her, the way you hold something solid when the ground shifts. She did not look up immediately. She looked at the paper for 3 seconds, the way a person looks at something familiar when they need a moment to be ready. Then she looked up. 400 people had turned to look at table 22. Comfort Akiompong's wine glass was where she had set it, her hand beside it, but not touching it. Festus Darko, the event coordinator, had come to stand at the edge of the ballroom floor, his lanyard hanging at his chest, not moving. The deputy minister's security detail had stopped scanning the room. Both of them were looking at the back left table. Olu Adeyemi Bright said, "The endowed scholarship chair being announced tonight carries her name. Not because we are honoring a donor, because we are honoring the origin, the person without whom none of what this foundation has built would exist." He lifted a card from the lectern and read it the way formal things are read when they have been made permanent in documents. The Adora Mensah Boateng Mathematics Scholarship Chair. 4 million cedis. In perpetuity. Beginning with the 2025 academic year. The room stood, not all at once. From the front tables first, the people whose response came before they had decided to respond, then through the middle section, then the back. Then the entire ballroom was on its feet, and the sound of 400 people applauding in a room with marble floors and high ceilings came down from the walls and ceiling and floor simultaneously, the kind of sound that enters the body rather than the ears. Adora Mensah Boateng sat in her chair for a moment longer than anyone expected. She was looking at the envelope in her hand. The envelope contained a letter she had written at 11:20 p.m. The night before, at her kitchen table on Zorwalu Road, sitting under the overhead light with a glass of water beside her, writing in her careful, even hand, the handwriting of someone who has spent decades making sure that what she wrote on a chalkboard was legible from the back row. She had written the letter because she did not know what she would need to say when she got to the gala, and she had always taught her students to prepare. She folded it now. She put it back in the envelope. She closed the brass clasp on her mother's purse, and the clasp clicked, and she stood. She walked from table 22 to the stage, 31 meters across the ballroom floor, past the round tables with their white cloths and the amber light, and 400 standing people. She walked in the ivory dress that Beatrice Mensah had worn in Kumasi in 1971, with the 2-centimeter tear at the left hem that a borrowed needle had repaired with almost matching thread, and not one person in that room was looking at the tear. On the stage, Olu Adeyemi Bright stepped back from the microphone. 2 full steps. The physical language of making room for someone when you finally understand who you have been looking for. Adora stood at the microphone. She looked out at 400 people still standing, at the light on all those faces turned toward her, at the quality of attention a room produces when it is holding more than one feeling at once. She said, "I remember him." Her voice was even, the practiced evenness of a woman who had spent 29 years making herself heard in rooms that were not designed for quiet voices. He asked me 3 times what a variable was. The first explanation I gave him used algebraic notation. The second I gave him used money, which seemed closer, but still not quite there. The third, I used seats on a bus. Empty seats waiting for passengers. He got it immediately. A pause that held something private in it. I have thought about the third explanation for 31 years. Because the third explanation is always there. For every concept. For every student. For every person who has been told they cannot understand something. The third explanation is always there. You just have to be patient enough to find it. She stepped back from the microphone. She looked at Olu Adeyemi Bright. She nodded once, not the nod of gratitude, but the nod of a teacher confirming that a student has produced, after considerable time and effort, the correct answer. He nodded back. Between them passed something that had been carried for 31 years and had just been set down. She returned to table 22. She sat down. She placed her mother's purse on the table in front of her, and she folded her hands, and the brass clasp caught the chandelier light the way it caught the light in that photograph from 1971. A small, reliable gleam. Grace, the portfolio manager, sat beside her without speaking for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "I had no idea." Adora looked at her. She said, "No one usually does." Comfort Kempong did not say anything. She reached for her wine glass and found it empty. She did not call for more. The gala continued for another 93 minutes. There was music, a small quartet that played high-life arrangements that moved from table to table through the air the way the good smell of food moves, and a prize draw, and 2 more speeches, and a dessert course of chin-chin and sliced mango, and small cups of sobolo that tasted of hibiscus and dried ginger, and a sweetness that sat at the back of the throat. Adara ate the mango. She left the sobolo untouched because she had never developed a taste for it, despite 30 years of it being offered at every occasion she had attended. Some things you simply do not acquire, no matter how long they are offered. At 10:47 p.m., a young woman from the foundation approached table 22. She was 20-something, natural hair pulled back, a tablet under her arm and a foundation lanyard at her neck. She introduced herself as Abina, communications coordinator. She said that Mr. Bright had asked whether Mrs. Mensa Boateng would be willing to speak to students at the Foundation's Cape Coast chapter the following month. There were 214 students currently in the program, 89 of them studying elective mathematics, and the Foundation had been searching for someone who could speak to them not just about the subject, but about the experience of being told you cannot do something and surviving that telling long enough to prove it wrong. She said the session would be 2 hours and the Foundation would provide transport from Accra. She also said, hesitating slightly, as though this next part was not her sentence to deliver, but she had been asked to deliver it, that Mr. Bright had mentioned that if Mrs. Mensa Boateng had any interest in reviewing the Foundation's current mathematics curriculum, there might be a formal conversation worth having. A consultancy. Something structured. Adora opened her purse. She took out the pen. She wrote her phone number on the inside flap of the envelope, the letter she had written at her kitchen table that she had not needed to read aloud, because the room had already said the thing she had come to say, and she handed the envelope to Abina. She said, "Tell him I have spent 29 years watching the wrong mathematics curriculum confuse intelligent children, and I have specific opinions about what needs to change. Tell him I am available." Abina smiled and said she would tell him exactly that. Adora said, "Use those words." At 11:14 p.m., Adara Mensa Boateng walked out of the Heritage Grand Hotel on Independence Avenue and stood at the edge of the taxi rank. The night air in Accra in November has a quality of almost coolness, not cold. Never cold here, but a loosening of the day's heat. A breath coming through. She could smell the street. Exhaust and something being grilled somewhere 2 blocks away. Charcoal and meat, and above the street, clearly, the sky. She stood with her mother's purse in both hands and looked up once at the sky and then raised her arm for a taxi. She gave the driver her address. She sat in the back with the purse on her lap. The city moved past the windows in the particular way cities move past windows at night, when you have just set something down that you have been carrying for a long time, lightly, without announcement. The lights and the dark and the suggestion of things simply continuing. The people who dismissed Adara Mensa Boateng that evening had access to every fact about her that they would later understand to be significant. The dress was in the room the whole time. The hands with the chalk callus were folded on the table. The purse with the brass clasp was there from 6:47 p.m. None of it told them what it actually contained, because they looked at the surface and believed they had seen the whole. This is a specific kind of error. It is not malice, it is a limitation dressed as a preference. You cannot take from a teacher what she knows. You cannot undone the third explanation she found for a struggling 19-year-old in a room with a broken ceiling fan. You cannot erase the 11 problems he got right in a row, or the chain of events those 11 problems set in motion, or the 3,847 students those events eventually made possible. You can look at the dress and make your quiet comment and reach for your glass. But the scholarship chair has already been named. The letter of invitation has already been read 3 times. The taxi has already been taken and paid for, and the address has already been given. The things that matter have already happened. Your opinion of the dress arrived too late to change any of them. This is true for every room you have ever walked into where someone decided before you spoke that they already knew what you were. They were wrong then. They will be wrong again. The third explanation is in you. It is patient. It is waiting for the room that knows how to receive it. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in the presence of. Sometimes the recognition comes 31 years later. In a ballroom in Accra on a November Thursday, when a man steps back from a microphone to make room for the person who made everything possible. And sometimes the recognition never comes from the people who owed it. And both of those outcomes leave you with the same thing. What you know, what you taught, what you built in 45 minutes in a room with no working fan, which no one can unlearn and no one can take back. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. Before you go, one question I want you to sit with. If a student you once gave a third explanation to 30 years ago came back having built something worth 4 million cedis and told a room of 400 people that the third explanation was the reason, would you remember giving it? Or would you remember the student, the desk they sat in, the particular Tuesday afternoon in April, the way their face changed when the variable became an empty seat on a bus? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. I'll see you in the next one.